The storm surge, that residue of floodwaters, will take days, if not weeks, actually, to subside. And because Florida is so flat, it ain't going to run away very quickly. So I think the recovery process will take several days. In terms of the intensity of the winds, they have peaked, but they are still peaking at over 100 miles an hour at the moment. They will start to subside through today. So the worst of the winds will drift off eastwards. Winds will gradually subside. Rainfall, phenomenal. Some places have seen 5 inches of rain in an hour. We cannot comprehend that much rainfall.
Hurricane Milton's made landfall in Florida about 3 hours ago after nearly 6 million people in Tampa were put under mandatory evacuation orders. Well, about half an hour ago or so, we checked into Orlando. The meteorologist Amy Sweezy explained what's happening to us. Tell us, what is the status of that?
Well, right now it is making its way across the state of Florida. So it did make landfall about 3.5 hours ago, 8:30 in Siesta Key, and that's just a little bit south of Tampa. So the main Bay Area in Tampa was actually spared from the strongest of the winds. But I mean, this was a difference of about 20-30 miles. So it was not a lot that it jogged a little bit to the south. So now as it makes its way across the peninsula of Florida and gets closer to Orlando, it is continuing to weaken a little bit. So that's why it's now downgraded. Just at 11 o'clock, about an hour ago, we were getting maximum winds about 100, 105 miles per hour.
Well, Milton is the third hurricane to make landfall in Florida this year. The last one, Helene, was just 2 weeks ago. This also had been predicted to be the worst storm in a century. Let's find out more. John Hammond is a meteorologist from Weather Trending. John, good morning.
Hi there, Rosie.
On this particular hurricane, it's been downgraded, hasn't it, from a Category 5 hurricane as it made landfall. Just explain to us what that means and how severe the storm is right now.
Yeah, okay. Category 5 is the top of the scale, if you like. It's the most intense storm in terms of air pressure at the centre and the winds revolving around it. This was a very compact storm as it crossed the Gulf of Mexico. It's actually expanded a bit like an ice dancer who spreads their arms out, or they will go around a little bit slower, but they will cover a larger area. So although technically Milton is lower than a 5 now, it's down to a 2. The aerial coverage of Milton is somewhat larger than it was, let's say, 24 hours ago. So the impacts actually are more widespread in terms of rainfall, in terms of wind speed, and you mentioned the storm surges and the tornadoes as well. So yes, I don't think we should make too much of the fact that Milton has technically gone down from a 5 to a 2. It's a devastating storm, as you say, once in a century for some places, and it will do further damage over the next several hours as it crosses bodily west to east across Florida. It's not far off Orlando now. It'll continue to track its way eastwards, and by this afternoon, it'll be out into the Atlantic. So a very vicious storm coming hard on the heels of Helene, as you say. Interestingly, Rosie, it's actually been quite a quiet hurricane season, contrary to many of the predictions which meteorologists have put out in advance of this hurricane season. The ingredients were there, have been there, for a really large and intense hurricane season. But until last week, actually, there hadn't been that many storms. We're playing catch up now, but it just does demonstrate how fickle and how difficult it is to predict exactly when and where these storms are going to occur. The other thing about Milton, Rosie, is how rapidly it developed from just a little tropical disturbance to a Cat 5 storm in just a number of hours. And that is just one feature, Rosie, which could well be a sign of the future. With global warming, it looks as if storms are developing more rapidly and suddenly going from a Cat 1 to a Cat 5. And one of the factors playing into that is the extraordinary warmth of the Gulf of Mexico, several degrees warmer than it would normally be at this time of year. It is the peak of the hurricane season, but whereas sea temperatures normally are around about 27, 28 degrees across the Gulf, they're in excess of 30 degrees across the Gulf of Mexico, and that would have supercharged Milton and caused it to rapidly intensify as it did over the last few days.
So we've got things like flooding, these storm surges, high winds. What is it, that combination that makes things so dangerous for residents, which is why they just have to evacuate?
Well, let's deal with the storm surge first of all. I don't like the word storm surge because there's no reference to the fact that it's actually a body of sea coming inland. That's basically what's going on with the storm surge. A hurricane is a giant vortex, a giant vacuum, which is sucking up the sea and transporting it inland. So you've got a sort of a 15-foot wall of seawater moving its way across the shore and into the neighborhood adjacent to the coast. And that water, I'm afraid, will be a concoction of seawater, rainfall, and sewage. And I think for coastal areas, that will take a long time to subside. Although Milton is sailing off eastwards now, or the winds may be starting to die down, the storm surge, that residue of floodwaters, will take days, if not weeks, actually, to subside. And because Florida is so flat, it ain't going to run away very quickly. So I think the recovery process will take several days. In terms of the intensity of the winds, they have peaked, but they are still peaking at over 100 miles an hour at the moment. They will start to subside through today. So the worst of the winds will drift off eastwards. Winds will gradually subside. Rainfall, phenomenal. Some places have seen 5 inches of rain in an hour. We cannot comprehend that much rainfall. We don't get that much rainfall in this part of the world. Actually, they don't get that much rainfall in Florida. Unprecedented amounts of rainfall. Again, the rain will start to subside, as will the risk of tornadoes. And within 24 hours, the hurricane will have gone. The sun will be out. But as I say, the recovery process will take days.
Yeah, already hampered
weeks.
by that last hurricane just 2 weeks ago. What we're hearing, John, and just finally from you, is that we're not necessarily seeing more hurricanes, but the ones that come are worse in their intensity. Is that right?
Yeah, it's a really tricky one to nail down, Rosie, as to the question: are hurricanes becoming more dangerous, more severe? There's not enough data. At the moment, we've only got sort of decades worth of data to sort of compare with how it was 50, 60, 70 years ago. What modelers do now is do a thing called attribution. They can run the atmosphere as it was 50 or 60 years ago and say, if the atmospherics were as they are right now, how intense would Milton have been? And over the next few weeks, meteorologists will be running those models and saying, well, has the fact that the Gulf of Mexico is over 30 degrees warm, has that meant that Milton has intensified more rapidly? The answer is probably yes, because seawater, the temperatures of the seas is the fuel which supercharges these storms. But there are other factors, Rosie. It's not just seawater, it's the atmospherics, it's the dynamics in the atmosphere. It's a very complicated business. So it's not simple to say, yes, storms are becoming more intense and more frequent because of global warming. It is but one factor. But the fact that the atmosphere is warmer, it holds more water, for example, and the seas are warmer, which supercharge the storms in the first place, suggests that, yes, storms will become more intense, not necessarily more frequent because there are other factors involved, but certainly when we get a storm, it's likely to be more intense and rapidly intensify as this one has.
John, thank you so much. John Hammond, meteorologist from Weather Trending, talking us through the very latest as Hurricane Milton made landfall in Florida. Just, I think, about 3.5 hours ago. We'll keep you across this here on Times Radio.